The initial expense of building a gaming PC can often be daunting for first-time builders. One way to spread out that cost is to incrementally upgrade a pre-built machine that you may already own. By only upgrading one piece at a time, you're able to continue using a PC while slowly making it more powerful until you have a full-on gaming machine. But which parts should you upgrade and when? What kinds of compatibility issues are you likely to encounter? That's what we're going to talk about today. Modern PC building isn't the technical endeavor that it used to be. Today it's often referred to as Legos for adults. Parts tend to generally stick to families, and as long as you stick to this generation of parts, you're usually in good shape. Older PCs mean less compatibility. Modern parts that are likely to be compatible with PCs less than 10 years old would be power supplies, SATA storage drives, PCIe cards such as graphics or Wi-Fi, case fans, and of course optical drives. You can buy any of those parts that will work on any modern day computer, and they'll also likewise probably be compatible with any computer built in the last 10 years or so. However, parts that are not likely to be compatible are CPUs, motherboards, and RAM. Our use case today is the Dell XPS 8700. This sample has an i7-4770, a stock Intel cooler, Dell proprietary motherboard, 12 gigs of DDR3 RAM. For graphics, it has a Radeon R9 270, 2TB hard drive, 500-watt 80+ white PSU, one system fan, and a micro ATX case with despicably poor airflow. The first part of any PC build before you even start buying parts is to identify potential bottlenecks. This applies to building a machine from scratch or upgrading a pre-built machine. The processor, for example, is a 4770. While not unlocked, it's still an i7 that's not that old. It's still a really good processor and will be more than enough for gaming at least for the next couple of years. And if you upgrade the processor to a newer chipset, that means you'll need a new motherboard to go along with it. A new motherboard is only going to support DDR4 RAM. It's not backwards or forwards compatible. So if you upgrade the processor, gotta upgrade the motherboard, which means you also have to upgrade the RAM. That's going to be a pretty significant expense for not much of an increase in performance. You can take that same amount of money and apply it to something like the graphics card and see a much larger return on performance. So the upgrades that we're going to be performing on this machine are replacing the R9 270 with a GTX 970. The R9 270 is an AMD card that was released in Q3 of 2013. The GTX 970, on the other hand, is an offering by NVIDIA that was released in Q3 of 2014. It was released at a price of $329, is clocked at over 1000 MHz, it has 4 gigs of VRAM, and has almost an identical TDP of 148 watts. The storage is the next thing to replace. By having your operating system on flash storage like a solid state drive, you're able to navigate menus and windows and start up the computer and shut down the computer much faster. It's going to make your computer feel very snappy. For that reason, we're replacing the 2TB hard drive with a 480 gig SSD. We're going to clone the hard drive onto the SSD and then repurpose the hard drive as a games library drive. As far as cooling goes, we also replaced the Intel box cooler with an Arctic Freezer 33. This provides significantly better temperatures with a new cooler, new case, new GPU, and added system fans. While the internal temperature of the case remained the same, the CPU and GPU saw 12 and 13 degree decreases respectively. Not to mention, you can take this cooler and use it on the processor that you will eventually upgrade to, and thereby giving you the ability to overclock it. I did a full review of this cooler, and that can be found up in the cards. The power supply was also upgraded. Now, the existing power supply was actually pretty good, but since it doesn't have any drastic effect on any of the other components, we felt it was a good opportunity to upgrade it anyway. We replaced the 500-watt 80+ white PSU with a semi-modular 550-watt 80+ bronze power supply. This provides slightly better overhead for future overclocking, it's more efficient, it's going to run cooler, it provides less cable clutter for better airflow, and frankly, you guys should know by now how I feel about ketchup and mustard cables. Finally, we have the case. We're replacing the stock Dell XPS case with notoriously horrible thermal control with an Inwind 301 tempered glass case. The new case provides better airflow, it's easier to work in, provides better cable management, has dust filters, a tempered glass side panel, and it also has better compatibility for future upgrades such as water cooling or the addition of some supplemental drives. A full review of this case can likewise be found up in the cards. And then we have fans. We're replacing the Arctic Freezer PWM fan that came with the Freezer 33 with a Corsair 120mm Pro. We're also replacing the 90mm exhaust fan with a 120mm Cooler Master sickle fan. We also added an additional 2 Corsair 120mm AF fans for intake. But things weren't exactly simple. If you're building a computer from scratch, you can kind of work out any potential compatibility issues in the front end and choose different parts that are more likely to be compatible. Unfortunately, working with a pre-built machine, what you have is kind of what you're stuck with, and you have to make sure any parts you buy are going to be compatible with what you already have. And this is going to take a fair amount of research. The Dell motherboard, for example, has a proprietary front power pinout. I had to do some research to find out exactly what orientation the front I/O needed to be plugged in order to work. You can find that pinout in the video description. There's also only one system fan header on this motherboard, which means a Molex to 3-pin power adapter needed to be used in order to supplement additional fans. Then there was the issue with the GTX 970 not being compatible with this motherboard because the BIOS actually didn't run it. The BIOS version we were using was an A01 when you actually need the A10, the most recent version, in order to run GTX cards. But of course, if you call up Dell and tell them you're trying to swap out graphics cards, they're not going to tell you that. They're just going to tell you to buy a whole new computer because, of course, they would. The existing SATA cables inside that tiny, compact Dell XPS system were not sufficiently long enough to connect drives all the way at the top of the case down to their associated connectors on the motherboard. Thankfully, I had some existing SATA cables from a previous build that were long enough, but keep that in mind. Your newer case is likely going to be a little bit larger, and you want to make sure all your cables are going to reach. And then we used fans on the intake on the bottom, and I know this sounds a little bit weird to do that instead of having them at the front. You could put them at the front, but there's actually no dust filter at the front of this case. The only dust filter is on the bottom. However, this did introduce a couple of problems. It made installing the I/O, USB, and audio headers on the motherboard much more difficult because they cover those up. They also cover up that bottom PCIe bracket. We weren't currently using it, but if you do want to use something down there at some point, you're going to have to move one of those fans. There's also not much space between the fans on the bottom of the case and the fans on the GPU. There's only about 2 centimeters of room there, so if you're routing cables through there, you got to be really careful that those cables aren't going to get caught. It did, however, help the thermals of our graphics card because it brought cold air from the bottom right into that GPU. It literally goes right into it. So the thermals on the GPU are actually really good. The case also does not provide any support for an optical drive. Now, I know it's 2017, who uses an optical drive anymore, but the XPS case that it came from did have an optical drive in there, and unfortunately it's just kind of sitting around now. If you have to, you can of course just buy an external optical drive, but honestly no one really uses those anymore. Finally, the last impediment we faced was the wireless card. Now, there are wires leading up to the antenna at the top of the case. We had to pluck those out. You could preserve those and find a way to route them and reconnect them to the new case. I don't know if you need to Dremel some holes or use zip ties. It would be kind of messy, whatever you decided to do. You're better off just buying a new PCIe wireless network card for 20 or 30 bucks. You're going to get way better reception that way anyway. After swapping all of this hardware, the only original parts left in this machine are the CPU, motherboard, RAM, and some of the cables. These can all be swapped out down the road for a modern i7-7700K Z270 motherboard and 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM for roughly $600. You can see how spreading out the cost of building a gaming machine over time makes building a gaming PC for gamers on a budget a much more approachable endeavor. If you found this video enjoyable and or insightful, consider giving it a like and consider subscribing. Another benefit to subscribing is that if you enter one of my giveaways that I run generally every month now, that will count as an entry. If you subscribe, that's one entry. There are several ways to enter all these contests. For sure, every single time subscribing to the channel will be counted as an entry. So go ahead and check that out in the video description below. If you want to see other computer builds that we've done recently, you can check those out here. We built a computer for my dad. That was a lot of fun. A $1,000 PC build that he still uses all the time. He's gaming every night on it. If you want to see that video, it's right there. That was a lot of fun. Go ahead and like, subscribe, share, and I will catch you guys in the next one.